Welcome, everybody, to the 24th episode of Stories from the Last Territory, podcast that covers the golden years of wrestling in Puerto Rico. My name is Luis Cuevas, better known as the Caveman, and I am your host for this trip back in time to the greatest feuds in the history of Puerto Rico. If you like what you hear and see, please subscribe to YouTube or in audio at Spotify's as Stories from the Last Territory. And I got an announcement. It is now available in Apple Music. So you can check on their Stories from the Last Territory in Apple Music and you'll be subscribed to this small but humble podcast that I try to do bi-weekly for all you guys. Today, we're going to do a small one. We're just going to get back on track, but I have a special announcement at the end of this podcast and I think you guys gonna like it if you love the content of this podcast. So hopefully you can stick to the end. Today, in our first one of this new year, we're going to be talking about some of the most famous, I would call them secondary rule breakers that came to the island during the golden years of the Capital Sports promotion. We're not going to be talking about people like Stan Hansen or Bruce Brody, Abdullah the Butcher, but some that came, made an impact, but not necessarily in most cases were in the main event picture, if that makes any sense. Hopefully, as we talk about them, you will get my point. So we're going to talk about those secondary rule breakers that made an impact in Puerto Rico. And we're going to start with one that was very good, especially from 1984 to 1986, and create a lot of havoc. And to this day, still remember as one of the best secondary rule breakers that we had here in the island. And we're talking about none other than Eric Embry, somebody who wrestled in Southwest, World Class, and many different promotions across the South. Well, he came as part of the exchange of talent between Capital Sports Promotion and Southwest Wrestling back at the end of 84, starting 85, somewhere around that area, and right away became a hit magnet with the fans in Puerto Rico. He would talk very despective of Puerto Ricans, calling us greasy Puerto Ricans or slimy Puerto Ricans, and that we were pigs and stuff like that. Just kind of calling us all kinds of names to get heat, and it worked. I mean, people really here in the island really hated him. They would call him Erika, thinking that he was effeminate and that he was gay, and that would drive him crazy. And to make matters worse, after talking bad about Puerto Ricans, he brought himself a woman valet that he found on the streets of Puerto Rico, basically saying that she was a prostitute or whatever. Her name was Sacha. She's a beautiful woman, probably the first valet in wrestling in Puerto Rico that we can remember. And he treated her like a slave and just treating her like really bad, and it just brought the ire of the fans in Puerto Rico. It was kind of like on the Savage, Elizabeth, or maybe Adrian Street versus Miss Linda, but in a very sleazy, very despicable, he would treat her like really bad. And he had some great feuds. Again, he never competed for like the Universal title or anything like that, but he seems like when he was here, he was always in the mix with somebody. He had great feuds with the likes of Jumping Joe Savoldi, including breaking his neck after a pile driver in Coliseo Roberto Clemente, by storyline, of course. Invader 3 for the World Junior Heavyweight title in a great match that I recommend you guys check out in YouTube. Invader 1. And his two biggest feuds, in my opinion, and maybe people who lived through it can remember them, were against Hugo Sabinovich, who was at that time the lead announcer. It was set up like Eric Embry will keep insulting Hugo Sabinovich into finally Hugo Sabinovich snap and attack Eric Embry, and that led to a series of matches that are well remembered. And also against the likes of Super Medic 1, that it led to a hair versus hair match. And later in the 90s, they continued that feud with Super Medic 1 and Super Medic 3 against Eric Embry and Rick Valentine. And that led to a famous, one of the last fire matches that we had here in Puerto Rico in 1991. Like I mentioned, he really was not in the main events, but he was a rule breaker that even to this day is well remembered because he was very effective in all the feuds that he had and all the tours that he had in the island from 1985 to 91. and again, all secondary feuds, but they were all great matches and great feuds, and he brought a lot of heat. And to this day, he's well remembered as one of the best secondary rule breakers that wrestle here in the island of Puerto Rico. So if you had never seen Eric Embry in Puerto Rico and can only remember his stuff for world class, well, go to YouTube and just put Eric Embry in WWC or Capital Sports, and you're gonna find yourself being attracted to what he did during his run in Puerto Rico. So he's one of those guys that I put in the top 10 maybe of the best secondary rule breakers in the island of Puerto Rico. Another one that we had here for a period of time was Killer Tim Brooks. He also came in the island in 1984, 1985, and he also was one of those wrestlers that, again, he might have like one match or two matches against Carlos or Invader, but mostly he will stay in the mid cards. And he started running an angle during this time where after his matches, he will grab a plate of beans and put it in a plate and just shove it in the face of the local wrestlers, getting the hate of the fans and, and calling us beaners and stuff like that. And it brought a lot of heat. There was another wrestler who kind of did something similar. We're going to be talking about him later in this podcast, but Killer Tim Brooks, that was his thing. He would come in after the match. He would put the plate of beans in the face of the wrestlers, and that's how he got heat. And he competed for the North American title on a couple occasions, the Puerto Rican title. Again, maybe not in the main event, but he was in the mix in the secondary feuds. His most famous feud was against Hercules Ayala for the North American title, and that ended in a cage match in the Roberto Clemente Stadium where Hercules Ayala defeated him in the cage, and that was the last time that we saw Killer Tim Brooks here in Puerto Rico. Again, not a very long run, but one that is remembered to this day because of the gimmick that he was using and the way he would talk about Puerto Ricans during that time. And the next one is, for me, one of the most, I would call him like the MVP of the secondary rule breakers in the island, especially during the golden years of the 1985 to 1988. He was a fabulous worker, both in tag team as in single matches. And we're talking about Ron Starr, El Primo, or Rambo Ron Starr. He pretty much was the backbone of the rule breakers, and he was the backbone also of Capital Sports Promotion, in the sense that you can always count on him, again, to go from like an opening match to main event. Whatever you needed at the moment, you could get from Ron Starr. And he was awesome in everything that he did. He had a great feud against Invader One for both the TV title and the Puerto Rico Heavyweight Championship. He also was great in tag team with Chiqui Star. And again, he could do anything. Whatever you need from him, if you needed him to do a first opening match, he would do it. If you needed him to do a main event, he would do it. In the spot shows, he was really a great wrestler here in the island. He had a great run, and his feud versus Invader One especially is amazing. There's a famous street fight that was held in Bayamon where they run throughout the whole stadium. That is, to this day, is an incredible match. He also had another one with him and Ponce for the TV title. And again, Ron Starr, one of those unsung MVPs or heroes of Capital Sports Promotion, especially during those years of 85 to 86, or 86 to 88. That was his prime years. And even when he came back in the 90s, wrestling as a tag team under the name of the Mercenaries or the Mercenarios, he did a great job. One of the biggest mistakes that Capital Sports Promotion did was turning him face against his primo Chiqui Star in 1988. It was just, people really didn't want to see him. They were so used to see him as a rule breaker, and I think that, believe it or not, he still has some gas left on the tank as a rule breaker, and he proved it when he came back in 90 as part of the Mercenarios. And again, a great wrestler in Capital Sports Promotion, great secondary rule breaker. He was not in the spot of Chiqui Star or the spot of Hanson Brody, but you knew that he was the glue, and he was one that you could count to give you a great 15 to 25 minute against anybody up and down the card, and you knew you get your money's worth for by seeing him. Compare him to Arn Anderson in WCW or the NWA, a guy you knew you will get your money's worth every time you see him wrestling in Puerto Rico. So he's also in my list of the best secondary wrestlers. Another one that's very well known in the United States for his running in Memphis and Mid South and Jim Crockett Promotions until he got fired. And in other promotions, Smoky Mountains, for example, is Buddy Landell. He came for the first time in 1982, being managed by Hugo Sabinovich, and right away made an impact. One of the greatest segments, interview-wise, from the old TV recordings was when Hugo, he was the man who introduced him to the island. Come here, buddy, my buddy, my buddy. Look at his body. Look at his muscular look. He's better looking. All the women are going crazy. I am going crazy seeing him. And Hugo just going way overboard with talking about how great Buddy Landell is, and Buddy Landell showing his muscles, because he came in as a muscle, bodybuilder and stuff like that. And Hugo Ricky Sanchez, implying that, well, I'm pretty sure he punched you up, Hugo, implying that Hugo was in love with with Buddy Landell, leaving Hugo speechless. And I mean, it was great that first promo. It's announced on Ali that Buddy Landell came in. It was one of the highlights of the Hugo Sabinovich run as a heel manager. He had a great feud with El Gran Apolo, who at that time was our local Lex Luger, to say the least, a muscle builder, bodybuilder, and they would do poses, and that led to a body press challenge, where they would have the bench press, and they did the whole Road Warriors versus Powers of Pain, and Buddy Landell attacked him, and that led to a feud between them. And then he had a very successful tag team with none other than Terry Gibbs, where they won the North American tag team titles. And he had his first run in the island was pretty good. I enjoyed at that time. We thought that maybe he would challenge for the world title or get involved with the Puerto Rico Heavyweight Championship with Invader, but for some reason or not, it was never meant to be. And he, after his run with Terry Gibbs as a tag team and his feud with King Tonga and Gran Apolo, he just kind of faded away and went to higher success in both Mid-South and Jim Crockett. And then we all know the story, right, of Buddy Landell. But he was awesome in that first run from 82 all the way to late 83. He was awesome in Puerto Rico. He came back in 1988, and he had a pretty good feud with TNT, Osario Vega. But again, he seemed to be stuck in the mid-card, and he just wasn't able to ever crack the main event here in Puerto Rico for some reason. I thought that maybe he would have done a pretty good run with Carlos Colon or even Invader 1, but it was never meant to be. But Buddy Landell, especially his first run of 82 to late 83, was pretty awesome, and I think you guys should check it out. Another wrestler that I think that deserved a lot of credit during this time as one of those secondaries or MVPs or I don't know, one of those underappreciated wrestlers that came during that time was Dick Steinborn, or like they used to call it here in Puerto Rico, Ricardo Steinborn, as he was called by the announcers. And he was really the link between the late 70s and early 80s as a rule breaker that could wrestle up and down the card. He was having great matches and feuds with the likes of Jose Rivera, Invader 1, Carlos Colon, and also Johnny Rivera. He held basically all the secondary titles in World Wrestling Council, Capital Sports, and you can always count on him for a good 20 to 25-minute match. He left right before the peak of the years of the mid-80s. He left right before Carlos Colon, or he left during the time when Carlos Colon won the World Wrestling Council Heavyweight Championship and was starting that chase for the Universal Championship. So we never got to see him challenging for the world title in Puerto Rico. But again, in the late 70s, early 80s, he was the man. He also served as a manager for some of the foreign wrestlers. So you had him being like a jack of all trades that later Profe became kind of deal. Uh, it would not be fair not to mention the great job he did in Puerto Rico, especially in those early years of Capital Sports Promotion, all the way to 1982 when he left the promotion. He passed away, of course, but he had some very, very good stuff. Sadly, a lot of the stuff that he did is not on video. Just the last of his run in '82 is in video, but before that, not a lot of it is on TV, so there's no video. But the magazines and everything, and to this day, fans remember him as one of the best. Another one I'm going to mention, I was not sure to include him in this list because his first run in the island has to be considered one of the greatest run in the island by any rule breaker. And I'm talking about Dirty Dutch Mantel as part of the tag team of Vaqueros del Mal or Vaqueros Locos, whatever you want to call them. They set attendance records that I don't think will ever be beaten in the island. We're talking about 10 weeks in a row with sold out arenas in their feud against the tag team against Carlos Colon and Jose Rivera. But the reality was that after that first run, he fits the bill of that secondary rule breaker that will come, create havoc, and then leave. He had a couple feuds with Invader. He had a couple feuds with Carlos Colon in the early 80s, the famous angle where he dressed up as Santa Claus and cost Carlos Colon the World Heavyweight title, the NWA World Heavyweight title from Harley Race. He also strangely was turned face in the late 80s in one of those turns that really did not make sense because he was just a natural rule breaker. And but in the 90s, he came back as a booker and as a rule breaker, and he helped elevate attendance in the 1993 to 1994 era as a member of La Familia de Don John Smith, had a great feud with Carlos over the World TV title and with Huracan Castillo. But yeah, Dutch is recognized in Puerto Rico as a savior, because he saved World Wrestling Council in the 90s and IWA with his booking. But from the start, he was always a great talent that came to the island and that people in Puerto Rico learned to appreciate and to follow him during most of his run here in Puerto Rico. And to finish, and not just, and he was not really in the glory years of Puerto Rico, but it would not be fair to do a great a podcast about the secondary rule breakers in Puerto Rico without including Eddie Gilbert, hot stuff Eddie Gilbert. From the moment that he came to Puerto Rico, he was a lightning bolt of heat. I mean, he had a lot of people mad at him. His feud with Huracan Castillo Jr. was an incredible feud. I mean, they went all over the island. They have fire matches. They all kinds of barbed wire, no disqualification matches. Eddie Gilbert really, and one thing I like about Eddie Gilbert, and when he came to the island, even though he was the booker, he never positioned himself as a challenger for the Universal Heavyweight title. He would let the Universal title have his own universe, and he would stick to the second feud or the third feud or secondary feud, and it worked for him. And again, his feud with Ray Gonzalez, with Huracan Castillo Jr. is some of the best stuff that you're going to see from Puerto Rico in the mid-90s. I know it's not the golden years era, but it was just an amazing run that Eddie Gilbert had. Even Father Bear. I mean, again, where he was, he brought heat to himself and eyes to the TV show, and people were going back to the house shows and stuff to see Eddie Gilbert get his punishment. And again, one thing I like about it was that he never put himself in the Universal title. Even though he was the booker or he was in charge, he would always set himself in the secondary or third. And to this day, is very much remember his run here in the island that sadly, of course, died when he passed away in the hotel room in 1995. But it was some of the best stuff you're gonna see. I know that he had burned some bridges in the United States, but here in Puerto Rico, he did a fabulous job as a secondary or third rule breaker in the island. So those are some. There are many, many more. We're talking Pierre Martel. Then he became, a baby face. Scott Hall came to the island, and then Akim Anumba. There's so many other secondary rule breakers, but I thought that these ones were like the peak of the secondary rule breakers that came to the island. Maybe I missed one or two. Would like to hear some of the other secondary rule breakers that you guys thought or think that should have been in this little list that we're doing for this podcast today. I got a couple announcements. Next week, we're going to debut a mini documentary that I did. I went to Puerto Rico to the Christmas break and did a little documentary with a good friend of mine and my girlfriend. And we went to all the stadiums that you have heard in many of these podcasts, the most famous arenas in Puerto Rico, stadiums. And we did a little mini documentary talking about the history of them, some of the most famous matches that happen in these arenas, and give you an idea, because we talk in all these podcasts, we talk about the Juan Ramón Lubriel Stadium or La Cancha Bajo Techo de Caguas, so we talk about Irán Bison or the Roberto Clemente Stadium. Well, we did a mini documentary. It's only going to be available in YouTube for the moment. That's going to be next week, next Monday at noon, Puerto Rico time, 10 a.m. Central Time, 11 a.m. Eastern. So hopefully you guys get to see some of the most famous arenas from our childhood in Puerto Rico, and the ones that made Puerto Rico such a hotbed of professional wrestling. So the main documentary, I think it's like 10 to 15 minutes. So I think you guys gonna like it. Again, we're gonna talk about the history of the stadium, when it was built, when Capital Sports Promotion started using them, and also some of the most famous matches that happened in those arenas or those stadiums in the history of Puerto Rico in the glory years. So stick with us for next week. That's going to be next Monday. It's going to debut in Spanish on this Wednesday in my other podcast, Desde los Territorios, or From the Territories, that we're celebrating our 200th episode. So if you know a little Spanish and want to see it in Spanish, well, check the YouTube page on Wednesday. In that, just waiting to Monday, and you guys going to have your feel other one in English. Also, I'm going to try to do this podcast on a weekly basis. My work has settled down a little bit, so I'll be able to do more stuff. And there might be a change of format for the podcast. We're working on a couple of things for this 2025 with a good friend of mine. So we'll see. We'll see. But stick around to Stories from the Last Territory. I think you guys are going to like what we are going to do in 2025. Until then, please subscribe. Please let anybody knows that you think that might like this podcast to listen to it. And you guys have an opinion, a comment, a question about the golden years of Puerto Rico, please let me know, and I will try to answer it in the next couple of weeks. Until then, like I always say, and like that great announcer Joaquin Padino used to say, sayonara, amigos.